Welcome to your weekend. I'm Mike Krause from the Independence Institute. Your usual host, John Caldera, is headlining a Hair Club for Men gig at the Airport Marriott. Should be back in a couple of weeks, so you're stuck with me, and unfortunately, you're stuck with this guy for a half hour. Randal O'Toole, how are you, sir?
Just fine, thank you.
Good, thanks. So you're a senior fellow at this little policy shop, the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and that out-of-the-way
village. But your real claim to fame is as the Transportation Policy Center Director right here at Independence Institute.
That's right.
Clearly. And you're in town on your book tour.
That's
for
right.
A new book, The Romance of the Rails. So I got to tell you, looking at the book, you got Romance of the Rails, and you got some really kind of cool pictures of trains. So it would seem on its face that this is a nostalgic look at the place of rail in our history and our culture, and it is, except that it's also a critique of rail and the billions of dollars of subsidies we're still pumping into it to try and keep it a mode of transportation in an urban environment. And you say that just doesn't work anymore. Do I have it right?
That's pretty much right. On one hand, I love passenger trains.
Clearly you do. You wrote a whole book about them.
That's right. My first passenger train was in 1957 when I was 5 years old. I went from Grand Forks, North Dakota to Portland, Oregon. And I've since done lots of work on rail restoration projects. I've ridden Amtrak hundreds of thousands of miles. I went 11,000 miles on Amtrak just last year alone. And I do what I can to preserve people's memories of passenger trains. But as much as I love passenger trains, I don't think other people should have to subsidize my hobby. I might love manual typewriters, which have been replaced by word processors, but that doesn't mean I think that the federal government should have a $1 billion industry to restore the manual typewriter, or a $1 billion subsidy to restore the manual typewriter industry. And so it's the same thing with passenger trains. I think they're cool. I think streetcars are neat. First job I ever had was restoring a streetcar. But at the same time, I think these are hobbyist things. Amtrak doesn't really work. Rail transit doesn't really work. It hasn't worked here in the Denver area. And high-speed rail is just a real high-speed money sink.
Well, let's talk about, because you said that rail doesn't work in the Denver metro area, but I don't understand how you can say that, because we've spent billions of dollars building out this light rail system here in Denver. So clearly we must be getting something out of all that money.
Well, in the year 2000, about 228,000 Denver residents drove to work, and only about 23,000 took transit to work. Since then, the number of Denver residents who drive to work has increased to 300,000. It's increased by 35%. The number of people who take transit to work, with all the light rail that's been built and the A-line and all the other projects that have been built, has increased by only 3,000 to about 26,000, by about a little over 10%. So partly in spite of, but actually possibly because of all the emphasis on rail, the percentage of people in Denver who are taking transit to work has actually declined. And that's been the case in cities all over the country. They build expensive rail projects. To pay for them, they end up cannibalizing their bus systems. And the bus systems usually serve minority neighborhoods. The rail systems are built to white middle-class neighborhoods. So you end up hurting the people who need transit in order to give people an image of, oh, I'm good because I ride transit to work once in a while.
And I was being facetious, obviously, about the billions and billions of dollars. Clearly we're getting something out of that. Actually, clearly we're not, and you make this great point that even as the population is growing here in Denver, the number of people actually using transit is declining. But one of the more interesting things is as more and more rail lines have opened up, what you have seen happen is they have begun closing and shrinking bus lines and bus schedules. And so in many ways, and you mentioned people feeling good about themselves, that in many ways they're screwing the poor and screwing the people who are what we say are transit dependent. So you're disabled to the point you can't drive, you're too broke to afford a car, maybe you lost your license and you need public transit to get around. You're actually being harmed by this $1 billion subsidy of light rail. Is Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. And you know, the one good thing that RTD has done is the Flatiron Express, which is a bus rapid transit line between Denver and Boulder. It goes 40 miles an hour on average. That's twice as fast as the fastest light rail line that RTD has. The airport line, which is commuter rail rather than light rail, goes about 30 miles an hour. So here we've got this fast bus, and buses are faster, they can move more people, they're cheaper, and they're actually safer than light rail as far as, you know, hitting cars and hitting pedestrians and things like that. And yet RTD decided to put most of its money into building all these rail lines that don't really work very well.
There's been this very clever thing that's been going on, is that every once in a while RTD will report an increase in light rail ridership. But what they'll leave out is that there's been a decrease in bus ridership because they've shut down another line or they've closed some bus stops.
And this is repeated all over the country. Los Angeles opened a new light rail line, and the Washington Post had a big article about how Los Angeles has discovered a way to get people out of their car. What they didn't note was that for every new rider on that light rail line, Los Angeles lost 5 bus riders. Charlotte, the same thing. You look at cities all over the country, they're opening up new light rail lines, or they're opening up streetcar lines or other kinds of rail lines, and they end up losing more bus riders than they gain rail riders. And so it's not good for transit riders. It's good for rail contractors, but it's not good for transit riders.
Okay, and actually you wrote a great study for Cato, and it's called The Coming Transit Apocalypse, and I'd like to talk about that, but before we do that, because here we are critiquing rail as a form of transportation in our modern age. There was a time when this worked. Tell us about what we might call the golden age of rail. So let's go back and take a look at a little bit of the history, and then we'll try and put some context as to why people are still desperate to try and keep this antiquated mode of transportation alive.
Well, in the 1890s, most urban jobs were in factories, and most factories were downtown. And new developments like streetcars and rapid transit and high-speed elevators enabled property owners to pack more people into downtown and then bring them into downtown on these various forms of rail transit. And it worked for people who could afford it. But it turns out most people couldn't afford the fares for either rapid transit or light rail or streetcars. And they certainly couldn't afford the fares for commuter rail, which were really expensive. And so most people in those days had to walk to work. We call that the golden age of transit. Both rail transit, urban transit ridership, and intercity ridership peaked in about 1920. And per capita ridership also peaked in about 1920. So we call that the golden age, but the reality is, as of 1920, probably about half of all Americans had never been on a train, they'd never been on a streetcar, they'd never been more than 50 miles from their home, unless they had gone out and bought a Model T Ford, and that was what finally gave them the mobility that only the wealthy had had before that. So we fast forward to today, and we're saying, oh, we're going to get people out of their car and onto rail transit. What we really mean is we're going to get people out of cheap transportation that anybody can afford and put them on really expensive transportation that only the wealthy can afford. And that's not really very fair. That's not really very American.
You say that you have this saying, you've told me this many times, you say that planners plan for people like themselves. And so these transportation planners that plan things like RTD and our light rail network, what they're really doing is that they're planning a rail system for a very small percent of the population who might ride it because it's convenient for them and because they have the means and the time to commute that way. But we're leaving behind large numbers of people who frankly should be in cars. But here's the funny thing, and the new buzzword we hear around Denver metro area is not let's talk about what people really want. What we're saying now is we need to figure out how to get people out of their cars and onto public transit. So they're not trying to make transit better, they're just trying to make driving less convenient. Am I getting that right?
Yes, and that's a movement in almost half of American metro areas. Not a majority, but maybe 35 to 40% of metro areas are focused on, let's make congestion worse, let's increase parking costs, let's do other things to discourage people from driving. You've probably been on streets where they say signals are set for a certain speed, so if you go faster than that, you're going to have to stop more often. I've been in cities where they say signals are set to require frequent stops. So no matter what you do, you can't go through all the signals without missing some of them. And so the point is, they think cars are bad. Even though cars have produced enormous wealth, they've freed a lot of people. You couldn't have had the women's rights movement without having two-car families. You couldn't have had the black civil rights movement without blacks being able to afford cars as an alternative to sitting in the back of the bus. You know, they've contributed to freedom for lots of people, and yet somehow we've decided to demonize them.
I find this really interesting because a lot of this is people think they're doing something good for the environment by getting people out of their cars and putting them on public transit. But it seems that they would almost feel the same way, even if everybody was driving an electric car, they still want people out of their cars. So it seems to be an anti-car thing more than an actual like conservation movement or environmental issue. You think?
Well, it has to be, because except in New York, Portland, San Francisco, and Honolulu, cars actually use less energy per passenger mile than transit. Transit is the brown form of travel in Denver and almost every other urban area except for those four I mentioned. It uses more energy per passenger mile, and it produces more greenhouse gases per passenger mile. So if you want to save energy, you'd be better off driving around alone in your SUV than riding on an RTD bus.
In Denver, well, at least for the Regional Transportation District, and we were looking at these numbers, that the RTD's budget is around $2 billion a year, and they're moving 4.5% of the daily metro area commutes. The Colorado Department of Transportation is roughly responsible for the rest of the state, and they have about a $1.7 billion budget. So what would it look like if everybody actually had to pay the full cost of riding public transit?
I don't think we'd have any public transit outside of New York and possibly Chicago and a couple other cities. There would still be some private transit in some downtown areas and things like that. Ford Motor Company owns a transit bus company called Chariot that is competing against public transit in 10 different cities across the country. And we'd still see some of that, but for the most part, you wouldn't see transit going from Golden to Denver. You wouldn't see transit going from Boulder to Golden, and probably not Boulder to Denver. And you probably wouldn't see transit going from Denver to the airport other than Super Shuttle and things like that. What we think of in terms of public transit is a very obsolete form of travel. Whether it's bus or rail, it's really a 50 to 100-year-old form of travel, and it's been superseded. Right now, Uber and Lyft and other ride-hailing companies are stealing customers away from transit, and transit is hemorrhaging ridership. It's been declining every year since 2014. Nationwide, in every major urban area except for Seattle, it's declining, including Denver. And I don't think it's ever going to go back up again, because Uber and Lyft aren't going to go away. Gas prices seem to be pretty stable. There's no reason why ridership is going to go up again. And so cities that are investing more in building either dedicated busways or building rail transit are wasting their taxpayers' money.
All right, there's a lot more to this than just moving people from point A to point B, because here's what we see is that you put in this fixed rail guidance system, right, to move people from point A to point B. And then in between point A and point B, you put stations. And then you start building things. So this isn't just about transportation. This is also about housing. This is also about development. So the big push here in Denver, and I assume this is like this in lots of places of the country, is transit-oriented development, that you want to develop around transit. And what the transit advocates would say was, look at all this development that this transit line has attracted. But it's not actually attracting development. What's attracting the development?
Subsidies.
Explain that when you say subsidies attract development.
In most cases, those new developments get subsidized either in the form of direct grants to the developers, or the cities put in the infrastructure that the developers would normally have to put in themselves, or various other kinds of subsidies. And what's really going on is a rather sad story. In 1961, a woman named Jane Jacobs published a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And she was defending her neighborhood in New York City from being torn down as a slum and turned into high-rise luxury condominiums. her neighborhood was Greenwich Village. It was 5-story apartment buildings with shops on the ground floor. And she said, this is a nice way to live. And it's not a slum, and you shouldn't tear it down and replace it with luxury apartment buildings. Okay, that's fine. Urban planners read that, and they said, Greenwich Village is the ideal way to live. That's the way everybody should live, and so we're going to build Greenwich Villages everywhere. A group called the Congress for the New Urbanism actually wrote in their platform that all new development should be like Greenwich Village, and all existing suburbs should be rebuilt into Greenwich Villages. So you look around Denver, and it's hard to miss. Denver, Lakewood, all the suburbs, even as far as Fort Collins, there's all these 5-story apartment buildings. They're trying to make Greenwich Village in the Front Range. And there's no need to have a Greenwich Village here. We don't have a shortage of land. We don't have a shortage of transportation. We don't need expensive transit. We have cars.
It almost sounds like you think that it's okay to live in the suburbs, Randal. I mean, is this true? Do you I mean, and I'm being facetious here, but one of the things we always hear is that sprawl is environmentally bad, and that sprawl is heavily subsidized. And what people call sprawl is actually what, as I was talking to you today, I call people living where their tastes and preferences allow for. But what's wrong with that?
Well, I call sprawl affordable housing because low-density housing on cheap land at the urban fringe is a lot less expensive than building high-density housing. First of all, the land is cheap, and so you can buy a lot and build a house on it for less than you can buy a lot and build a dozen or 100 houses in the city center, because that lot in the city center costs 100 or more times than the lot in the suburbs. Second, construction costs for a 2-story house are a lot lower per square foot. For a 5-story building, the costs are 2 to 3 times greater than per square foot than a 2-story building. For a 10-story building, they can be up to 7 times greater than for a 2-story building, because you need a lot more cement, a lot more steel, and a lot more technical support for those kinds of buildings. So if you want affordable housing, the thing to do is to get rid of urban growth boundaries, which Denver has one, get rid of green belts, which Boulder has one, and let people live where they want to live. If they want to live in dense inner cities, that's fine. You've got LODO. If they want to live in the suburbs, that's fine. If they want to live in low-density suburbs, that's fine. The reason why people started getting concerned about sprawl is they thought we're running out of farmland. But the reality is America has 1.1 billion acres of agricultural land, and we only use 350 million of them for growing crops. Only about 75 million of them grow food that we eat directly. Another 125 million grow food for cattle and sheep and meat that we eat. And the rest of it is exported. And so of that 350 million acres, that's a third of our agricultural lands. It used to be 420 million acres in 1980, but it's shrunk. Not because of urban sprawl, but because our farmland productivities are increasing faster than our population. So we are protecting something that's extremely abundant by making something that's important, housing, extremely scarce. And that's a foolish thing to do.
All right, now we just moved into some new territory that's a hot topic around here, and that is housing. And the housing prices have, especially in the Denver metro area, have gone up significantly over the years. And now the big push by governments all over the metro area is affordable housing. Everybody wants to talk about affordable housing. And all the politicians want to be able to take credit for creating affordable housing. And they're using a misnomer, because when they say affordable housing, when politicians use that term or when planners use that term, they're really talking about subsidized housing. And subsidizing someone's housing doesn't make the housing stock any more affordable, right? It just subsidizes a portion of a small percentage of the population's housing.
Well, that's true.
Did I get that right?
That's true, especially when the subsidies come from people who already own homes. A lot of times, the subsidies come from a tax on new home construction, which is what Denver has done, or they come from property taxes, which is what Portland is doing. And so if you buy a home, you're going to end up paying more for your home because of this affordable housing program, unless you're one of the few lucky people who gets one of those affordable housing units. But really, this push for affordable housing is really just a push for density. because nobody's building low-density affordable housing, even though low-density housing is more affordable. What cities are doing is building high-density housing, and they're building, instead of a 2,000 square foot house, they're building 600 square foot apartments and saying, okay, that's more affordable. Of course, with the subsidies, it costs more than that 2,000 square foot house. But after the subsidies, you'll get that 600 square foot apartment for less than the 2,000 square foot house, and so you'll be grateful to us. Aren't we wonderful?
I've read this, I saw this really interesting, in fact, it might have been something you wrote, that according to like the American Community Surveys and the best data available, that overwhelmingly, and it cuts across racial lines, it cuts across gender lines, and it cuts across age, that Americans still overwhelmingly want to live in a single-family detached house in at least a suburban environment, not necessarily a suburb, but a suburban feeling neighborhood. Is that still true?
That's absolutely true, and there's this myth that millennials want to live in dense areas, and some of them do, but the reality is 60% of them say they want to live in a detached single-family home in the suburbs. There's this myth that baby boomers, once they become empty nesters, are going to move into the inner city so they can be near restaurants, and some of them want to, but most of them are either going to stay in the house that they raised their families in, or they're going to buy up. They're going to move into a bigger house somewhere else because they've got lots of toys and they need a space to put them in. And so we're not seeing this movement to the cities. You look at the inner cities and you say, okay, we have 20% more homes than we did 10 years ago. We've got people moving in, but we had so few homes 10 years ago in those areas that it didn't really, that's a drop in the bucket. The vast majority of growth today is still taking place in the suburbs, and as you say, it goes across all age classes except for people 85 and up, and it goes across all income classes and across all ethnic groups.
And when we talk about density, Denver's been on a density push. But I think people don't quite understand what density really is, because everybody likes to use like Los Angeles as an example of what sprawl looks like and something we should avoid. But interestingly, as you were telling me when we were talking before the show, that LA is one of the most dense places in the country. Explain that. What does density really look like?
Well, LA has the largest expanse of area that has more than 10,000 people per square mile of any place in the country, even more than New York City. New York City is really dense, but the New York urban area isn't. When you add in northern New Jersey and parts of Connecticut and upstate New York, the New York urban area has a little over 5,000 people per square mile. The Los Angeles urban area, which includes parts of Orange County, Pasadena, and so on, has 7,000 people per square mile. It's the densest urban area in the United States or Canada, followed by San Francisco, followed by San Jose, followed by Miami, and New York, I think, is only number 5. So the idea that density gets people out of their cars, well, you look at Los Angeles, that's obviously not true. The other idea about Los Angeles is that LA is a great big freeway. It turns out Los Angeles has the fewest miles of freeway of any major urban area in the country per capita. So for every million people, Los Angeles has about 50 miles of freeways, whereas Denver has closer to 100 miles of freeway. Houston has 130 miles of freeway per million people. So the reason why Los Angeles is so congested is because they've packed people in so tight and they haven't given them enough freeways for them to drive around on.
We've always had this, idea at Independence Institute that we talk about from time to time. It just doesn't get a lot of traction because it empowers individuals and it doesn't empower a transit bureaucracy. And that is that we're doing this massive subsidization of transit, not just in Denver, but all over the country, as you've talked about. And what we always say is, well, if you're going to do that, why not, instead of subsidizing an agency, why don't you give that subsidy directly to the people who need it the most in the form of some kind of transit or transportation voucher that they could use for whatever works for their needs in the moment, for whatever they need. But the problem is that could mean almost anything. It could mean an Uber, it could mean a cab, it could mean a shuttle bus, it could mean a bus, it could mean the light rail. But what happens to the transit bureaucracies if we ever started actually offering people meaningful alternatives to mobility that actually works for them, as opposed to what works for what the planners want?
Well, I think the transit bureaucracies are going to go away in a few years anyway, because ride-hailing is already eating into their market share, is eating into their ridership. In 10 years, probably 5 years, we're going to see driverless ride-hailing in most American cities. It's already starting in Phoenix. Waymo, which is the Google spinoff, is starting it in Phoenix. General Motors promises to start it in San Francisco next year. Ford Motor Company says they're going to start making millions of totally driverless cars with no steering wheel, no gas pedal, no brake pedal by 2021, and putting it in ride-hailing service. So if you can take a car, if you can pull an app on your smartphone and have a car come to your door and then take you where you want to go for about the price of a transit ride, or maybe a little more, but not much more, why are you going to walk to a transit stop, wait in the heat of the summer or the cold of the winter, get on a bus or a train that may be late, have it take you somewhere, and then have to walk somewhere else because you're probably not going to right where the transit stop is? The door-to-door service is convenient, it's faster, and it's probably going to be, when you take into account all the subsidies we give to transit, it's going to be cheaper than transit.
All right, let's get back to the book. Why don't you tell us,